On this week's Sitting Down with Scholars, I'm joined by Jacinda Taggart, a research associate. And Jacinda, can you start off by telling myself and my guests about what your research is so far? So, what is your career in research?
Yeah, so I'm kind of in two different branches of research. So my 9 to 5 is in Alzheimer's disease research, where we do clinical trials, but I'm mostly doing like the data analysis aspect. And then I also have a background in human memory, cognitive neuroscience. So how are we using images and quantifications of the brain to assess human memory and to kind of answer questions about human memory? So, those are the two main branches that I'm currently in for research, and I'm hoping to continue on one of those paths in the future for graduate school because I'm currently a research associate, kind of post back researching. Mhm.
So, when you say about looking into more the data analysis of memory, what type of approach are you take in terms of what does the data look like in its raw form that you're interacting with?
Yeah, so I've interacted with MRI data, so taking images of the brain and you kind of quantify the blood flow in the brain for fMRI, or you're quantifying um, if you are doing structural images, you're quantifying, the cortex, the thickness of it, um, or the volume of the hippocampus. That's another one that we use a lot. And so we kind of use those quantitative measures and we correlate it with measures of cognition. So just a score ranging between whatever values you kind of want to assess as like low memory versus high memory, things like that.
And when you say working, so obviously work from a more clinical side, are these a mixture of various different individuals, both ones with the likes of potentially age-related or memory impacting diseases, as well as healthy participants, or is it more specifically individuals who have signed up to a clinical trial and are going from they're there because they're in either a control or a test group?
Yeah, so my main study that I work on is called US Pointer. And for this, we're using cognitively normal individuals. So they don't have Alzheimer's disease. But what they do that that kind of makes them more unique is they're sedentary. So they don't really exercise as much. They have kind of like a poor diet. And they have risk for cardiovascular disease. And so, um, although they're not technically in a clinical group such as Alzheimer's disease, they are known to have like higher risk in the future. And so we are using these older adults in this cohort, and we're separating them into two groups of, are they going to have a huge lifestyle intervention that kind of, improves um, their kind of lifestyle? And is that going to affect whether they improve in their cognition later on? And then the other half of the group is kind of just educated on lifestyle interventions, but not actually placed within the intervention itself.
Okay, and in terms of just thinking about your career in that sphere of research so far, how uh, how did you come into that particular field in terms of have you got a biological science, computer science, neuroscience background? What was the background motivation for your career?
Yeah, so I actually had a psychology degree in undergrad, but it was quantitative psychology. So I took a lot of statistics, I took coding, I took calculus. But as I learned more about cognitive neuroscience, so kind of combining neuroscience and psychology, I knew I wanted to pursue that intersection. And so I did a minor in neuroscience, took a few classes on brain disorders, took a few classes on neurobiology, and basically, because of my statistics and coding background, it really prepared me for my current role that does a lot of Python and R, the data analysis and management side of things. Um, and yeah, I think that's pretty much how I got to this place is through having both a quantitative and a neurobiology background. Yeah.
So, thinking of just various different individuals, particularly those who are, I suppose, in that little bit of a unknown bridged area where they are both interested in the really, like as you've said, like the quantitative, very data focused side of it, and also they've got an interest in whatever biological sciences, such as whether that be psychology or life sciences or so on. How would you say in terms of you got into more of the coding side of it? So the Pythons, uh, I'd imagine Python and R, similar to myself, are the ones you probably have used more of. But have you used any other coding languages, and how did you get introduced to them, and how did you find them?
Yeah, so in my undergrad degree, like you said, it was Python and R. That's kind of what they trained us on because that's what's typically used for social sciences or life sciences. I've also used MATLAB, which is really big for cognitive neuroscience. It's used to kind of like segment our MRI images into those little uh, quantifiable numbers. You know, we just stick it in MATLAB and it does everything for us. And then we also have Bash, which is kind of just used to throw everything into those MATLAB scripts. So those ones I kind of had to learn on the job more so than be taught in like a formal class setting. And so I usually tell people that if they want to do neuroimaging or if they want to do cognitive neuroscience, I usually say that they should do Python, R, and MATLAB because I've seen those are the three big ones, and it was for sure a trial and error thing for me.
And I'm just thinking, as someone who came to more my experience with coding, really at the PhD point, what would you say to those who are potentially a bit more apprehensive? They're really into biology, they're interested in the likes of understanding the coding languages, but they don't necessarily think it's something that they can do. They see it as way too complicated for where they're at, or they've never done any coding and they're maybe a bit more senior, and they're thinking, I've got to go back into research, and coding's putting me off. Have you got any advice for them?
Yeah, so my main thing is this is kind of embarrassing, but I'm not that good at coding either. But what really kind of shaped my understanding of coding is that if you have the problem solving or the logic aspect of it, which a lot of people that are in biological sciences, you know, they can kind of think of like problem solving and they use that problem solving aspect and they just kind of like ask the internet, which is what I do. I kind of say,
Same.
well, you know, I want to do this this particular task would require, you know, maybe a for loop or something. So then I would say like, oh, in MATLAB, how would you format the for loop for this specific task? And so I do use the internet a lot because it's very easily accessible and you kind of learn as you ask more questions. You kind of see the same structure, the syntax. And so that's kind of how I've learned coding is just being like very like I don't know how to say it, just going head on into the problems and trying to work through it logically more so than saying, "Oh, I need to sit down and write this whole program all by myself." And
Mhm.
that seemed like a lot more doable to me.
No, and like you say, I think accessing the various tools, whether it's I know a lot of chat room resources, whether it
Mhm.
be some people putting their code into an AI program. I will say, with the caveat of if you're putting your intellectual property into an AI program, make sure that it's protected in terms of that. But I do know a lot of students that I've taught who put their code into a chatbot and say, what is wrong with this code? Why is it breaking? But like you say, there's plenty of resources there to help. But I think one of the other things that normally is a question that I tend to get from various different students, particularly, and I think especially when it's individuals representing various different fields within either the sciences or within biology itself. What is the element that really motivated you, that personable element, that rather than necessarily where you're at currently, what was the motivation that really drove you to pursue your particular subject, whether it is Alzheimer's research and cognitive diseases, or the field in general, however you want to take it?
Yeah, so I had like a really weird introduction to science. I didn't know about science as a career until I stepped foot into college and I took my first psych class. I thought psychology was just for like therapists, you know, and I thought I was going to be learning about disorders and I thought I was going to be learning about therapies. But instead, I took Gen Psych, general psych, and it was all about the psychological science. And I got to the point where we were learning about memory. It was just like a 1 week like module in the class, and for some reason, I just felt super drawn to it, and I couldn't really tell why. I also was taking an English class at the time that focused a lot on memory, and but that was more from like a writing standpoint, you know. So like, how are we using memory as a like a plot point, or how are we using it as a theme? And I don't know, I felt very inspired by that kind of like interconnection between science and communication. And my father also has like memory impairment, not clinically, but more so just like he has trouble remembering a lot of details of his life or of like conversations that we have. And so I think all of those different factors at such like a formative point, you know, like right at the beginning of college, it felt more like a fate thing to me, where I was like, I feel like this is what I want to study. And as I learned more about learning and memory and how the brain works, I kind of knew that I was solidified in that field. And the Alzheimer's disease research is particularly interesting because we're looking at how the brain like directly corresponds to your like lifestyle and your cognition. So I think that's really important and interesting as well.
So, with you saying, pulling up on the point about memory specifically, is there a particular element of memory in general in terms of is it more how we learn, how we recall? What is it about memory specifically for those who might not necessarily know the depth that that particular subject has?
Yeah, so I prefer kind of more like episodic memory. So this is how you're recalling events in your life. How are you recalling events that happened? There's also other forms of memory, like you said, like learning. So how are you retrieving information that you are studying? I've done a few studies on that. And it is interesting because I do like an educational perspective to, or educational applications, I should say, to research as well. But I think I'm more interested in learning how does our brain kind of segment um, these episodic memories that we have, and how are these different segments of our memories enhanced, or how are they worsened over time? So I'm interested in how attention is affecting your your ability to recall an event that happens to you, whether it be uh, you know, right after the event, or if it's a week after the event. How does it happen for months later? Things like that are particularly interesting.
And just thinking, I know this is a more of a very specific sub-element of memory, but I'm just more wondering, I know it might not be your area of research, but just wondering your take on that in terms of when people discuss, when they talk about more, or how our memory, how we respond to trauma, particularly if there's something that where people always say, when you remember that one thing that's really happened to you, that was a bad moment that you happen to recall absolutely perfectly, and then the good memory that you really struggle to recall but you really want to. In terms of what the researcher in that area, or just a thought around why do we remember those more traumatic, problematic, or stressful memories rather than the happy, good, and fond memories? What is it that really motivates the brain to, or what is the reason behind that?
Yeah, so there's kind of like two ways to think about it. So I'm interested in how, um, like I said, like attention or how different aspects of the event itself are relating to memory. And so one of these different elements could be the kind of neurotransmitter reasons. So you're having a very emotional event, you're having um, this very adverse event. And so it has been shown that like dopamine in the brain strengthens memories for the adverse events. So from like a neurobiological perspective, that's like an answer. But a more like conceptual answer is that when you're remembering bad moments, this is usually a rumination thing, and you're usually thinking about this event all the time. You think about it, right when it happens. You think about it the day after. You think about it a few days after, and it's kind of always being strengthened. And every time you recall a memory, it's kind of like it's not like taking a picture. It's more like painting a a portrait or something. So every time that you are doing this, you're becoming better at it. You're
Mm-hmm.
really kind of just perfecting this portrait. And so in your brain, it's doing the same thing. Every time you're recalling this event, that memory is getting strengthened through the neurons, essentially. And so that's why it feels so vivid. That's why it feels like you are just constantly remembering the bad moments compared to the good moments, because you kind of have a good moment and you're thinking, oh, that was really great. But it doesn't really have that same psychological effect as a traumatic moment has, where you're thinking about it all the time.
And just thinking about another area of which I know will be probably an area that a lot it's really out there point, but more of another facet of memory that I'm sure that many people be interested in finding just the more scientific perspective behind it is the whole when you either have had a new food that you've really enjoyed for the first time, but then you go back to the same restaurant and you go back and again, same with or listening to a piece of music, and there is a novelty factor of it. But in terms of, is there a reason, or what is the more scientific perspective in terms of how that novelty progressively dulls in terms of the dopamine, the pleasure response that we get from that? Because there is evidently a reason behind why we do it, but what is the more motivational side of what, well, not motivational, but what is the reason for that happening in the brain?
Yeah, so essentially, the way that we think about it is that you have two neurons and they are connecting with each other, and the dopamine is basically being released and from one neuron to the other neuron. And the response that the receiving neuron gets, its threshold is going to increase every time. So at first, this small like hit of dopamine is like, oh wow, this feels great. I love this. And it really has that powerful impact on the receiving neuron. But then the threshold just keeps getting higher with every, instance that you have with this food, or every instance that you have with this pleasurable activity, and that same dopamine hit just isn't going to have the same effect. And so this is also why we do see kind of like the doom scrolling effect with, TikTok or other social medias, where you kind of keep going because you're like, oh, this one that comes later is going to really excite me, but I just need to keep hitting the small ones first before that really exciting one like really hits. So
Is that a bit like the case of I can remember? Admittedly, this was an undergraduate class that I can remember doing the whole how the jackpot effect works. Where if you're a gambler, you're constantly pulling on that jackpot machine, hope because the little wins aren't going to be it, but you're just hoping for that one jackpot that's going to give you that massive rush.
yeah.
And that's the case.
Yeah, that's essentially it. So that's why social media is like kind of that's why controversially in the US they've tried to ban TikTok. I'm from the US, so that was a big kind of like selling point as to why we need to get rid of social media like that, is because it does kind of promote like a gambling sort of behavior. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I would say that those two effects are very similar. So, like you said, like the jackpot effect, and like a social media scrolling, it's
Mhm.
essentially the same thing.
So, trying to bring us back to more your personal career at this point, whether you're thinking about it from your educational, your academic journey, or from your interest in science, have you found any pivotal individuals that's really pushed or inspired you to pursue the career that you have?
Yeah, so there's like a few individuals in my personal life that have really inspired me. Um, so there's a professor at Cal Poly SLO named James Anthony, and he essentially mentored me throughout like my initial introduction to research. So he also has done pretty much everything in memory research, from like sleep and memory to like computational neuroscience to even dopamine and memory, which is like what I want to study. And so seeing someone that was, working closely with me and very encouraging for me to pursue science when not everyone has been very encouraging for me to pursue science. I thought that was really motivating. And I saw how he was successful. I saw him from a postdoc to getting faculty positions and doing talks and, lectures at universities. Seeing someone that was very like humble and encouraging and very nice in that field was very, very eye opening um, that someone like me could also go down that path. But then some people that have also inspired me, kind of like from a science communication perspective. So Neuromelody or Lindsay at UPenn. She does a lot of neuroscience research on pain, and she does a lot of science communication videos on TikTok and Instagram Reels. And she also talks a lot about her journey with graduate school and as a PhD student at a Ivy League university. How is that both good and bad? And so that kind of inspired my like personal journey with showcasing science to general audiences and showcasing like the good and bad of science to students as well. So yeah, I have like a person that I look up to from like a career standpoint, and then someone that I look up to more for like the like not a hobby, but kind of like the I don't know how to say this. There was a word that I was going to say, and then it left. But like the end goal of like what do I want to do with my career, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
that would be to inspire other individuals or to be honest with them. Um, so yeah.
So, like, they're not necessarily just the research impact, but more the community impact
Yeah.
type individuals. It's interesting as well. You say about key elements that I think many people will think to when they think about inspiring individuals, whether that's humility, whether that's a lot of people use terms like nice because it's more the approachable, very communicable type elements, and I'm assuming that most of those individuals will both be equally as interested in offering not just the advice and guidance, but just general support to see you grow in your field. And that's, I'd imagine, what most of the time those types of individuals embody in terms of their advice, whether that's very direct advice, such as mentoring, or whether it's indirect advice, such as here's a reel about my experience and this is, like you say. And it's interesting as well, you said about the good and bad elements, whether from from the more academic point of view, or whether that's from the other people you've interacted with on TikTok and Instagram. Do you find that the human element of breaking down, yeah, it's great, but also the bad is really interesting to see? Or what do you think the value of painting that more even picture is?
Yeah, so I didn't really realize the importance of it until I started doing it, I guess. When I started talking about my experience with graduate school applications, how this was affected um, through recent events and a bunch of uncertainties in science as a field. And I started receiving a lot of comments and DMs basically saying that they were going through similar experiences as I currently am, and they're saying that it makes them feel less alone. It makes them feel like even though it seems daunting and it seems like it's the end of the world, it's actually okay because other people are kind of going through those same feelings as well. And I think that's why it's really important to paint like an even picture on career paths. It doesn't even have to just be science. It could be any career path, kind of expressing the good and the bad, because then when other people are experiencing those bad moments or having those like negative emotions, they realize it's more normal than what it's like supposed to be. Because if everyone was saying, "Oh, my PhD experience was so amazing, and I did so much studying, and I got my dissertation, and everything was perfect," um, then that kind of makes more isolating feelings in the individual that is experiencing a tougher time. And they're like, oh, maybe I'm not cut out for this, or oh, maybe I wasn't good enough, And instead, if we show that anyone can experience those bad moments, then it kind of builds a stronger community and or a stronger sense of community and a stronger kind of internal validation. And yeah.
I'm just wanting to go back to one point that you said about the individuals who reach out after they're effectively having their own opinions validated by the experiences of others on social media. And it's one area that I think particularly that there is a lot of resources at most universities where, whether that's career advice, personal advice, financial advice, whatever advice is really that you're really seeking out, there is normally some form of advice at your university, but there is some form of reason why more people feel more confident going to effectively a stranger who they feel like they form that relationship with, whether that's through watching their content or engaging in the comment section. But there's a reason why they feel motivated to reach out to those individuals rather than reach out to their supervisor. And I'm just wondering, I have my own thoughts on that, but I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, so I think it depends on a lot of factors. So my initial reaction is if someone's the same age range as me, so a lot of my followers are within that 22 to 25 range, and they kind of see me more as a friend, more so than as like a stranger. It kind of is like a parasocial thing with social media where when you see someone so often, you're kind of just like, oh, I know that person. Oh, that person seems like my friend, even though I don't know them. And I've received a few comments like that too, or a few DMs where they're like, oh, I kind of look forward to your content, or oh, I view you kind of like as my friend that's not my friend, thing. So that could be like one psychological aspect of it. But then another thing could be that once you start talking about it with someone that you know personally, like in real life or anything like that, it does feel more real and it feels more daunting and it feels kind of like you're speaking it into existence compared to if you just type on your phone and send it off and maybe that other person will see it, maybe they won't. I feel like that's kind of like another distinct difference between going to, say, your PhD supervisor versus just going to someone that you saw on TikTok or something similar.
Yeah, I think that's definitely more my take on it is,
Hmm.
but more from the potentially the consequence for the individual who's putting themselves out there. If I was to go and have a conversation with my PhD supervisor, it's more a similar relationship, although not quite, to a junior employee to the boss, and you're asking, and a lot of people therefore don't want to ask what might seem as a stupid question, but they're more than happy to ask. And a lot of the times, my supervisors have certainly said this, and I've heard many different supervisors say this. There isn't a stupid question, but getting the person to step out of their own way to see that it's not a stupid question is a challenge within itself, and it's something that niggling feeling that you have at the back of your head that says, I shouldn't say that. I want to ask that question, but I should not say it, and therefore most people don't in those cases, or they turn to someone else. But just thinking in terms of, I know you've said about the more supportive academic community around you in terms of with James and so on. But what has been that relationship in terms of how they've approached that mentoring mentee type relationship with you? How have you? What I suppose the question is more, how do you feel they've approached that particular type of interaction?
Yeah, so I've had a bunch of different mentors over the years. Some of them have been very hands off, kind of check in every few months or so. I've had some that schedule like a weekly meeting, but it's very structured and it's very like, you get your 1 hour, you're going to ask your questions. We're going to talk about research, things like that. But the thing that's different with like James or other different postdocs, it's usually postdocs that I have this kind of like uh, better mentor mentee relationship with. And what happens with these individuals is they're kind of treating you like, um, like a friend almost. So they are very honest about, when things need to be improved on, but they're not going to say it in a very like strict or harsh way. Instead, they're going to be like, "Oh, well, you did like a really good effort. I just left a few comments or considerations, so like if I'm writing a paper or something, it would be something like that. It could also be just the way that they message, so on Slack or on email. Is it more casual in conversation, or is it very like structured? I feel like those small details also matter when you're having like a mentor mentee relationship, because it feels less pressure on you. Like, they're your supervisor and you know that they're, your boss essentially, but they kind of treat it like a colleague, so you're kind of on a similar or same level, even if both that's not true. Um, so I feel like that's kind of my main take on it, is that it's they want to see you grow, and so they're not going to like tear you down compared to more senior staff or senior individuals that kind of give that tough love type of mentor mentee relationship. But that some people like prefer the latter. So um, for me personally, I prefer that more like colleague type mentorship style.
And do you find the style that you like to be mentored in is the style that equally, this is more from an education perspective, I suppose, that you prefer to, if you're on the reverse of that role, do you prefer to be that type of mentor, or do you take a different approach entirely?
Oh yeah. So I have a few like undergraduates that I mentor, a few high schoolers that I mentor, and I do kind of try to keep it like a friendly conversation. If they ask questions that are, you know, like on a simpler side, I don't say like, "Oh, that's a dumb question." I kind of like explain what the answer is, and then I make sure that they fully understand it. If I say things that are too complex or anything. I kind of encourage that kind of like back and forth conversation instead of um, like making it seem like I'm testing them or anything. And if they have like um, tasks that they do, I try to give them some leniency to kind of do the work on their own, and then provide feedback, and kind of help them through that lens as well.
And just thinking generally, I know you said about those college and equally the more undergraduate students, but do you actually have any teaching like responsibilities as part of your research role, or is it more? I know you do a lot with your own work outside of the various different more mentoring thing that you also do through your website and that type of thing. Is it how? What is your structure in terms of that type of approach?
Yeah, so for my job, I don't do too much with like teaching or mentoring. Um, and when I do, it's kind of like I said, like a collaborative effort more so than me teaching an individual something. But then outside of work, I do mentor individuals. And with that, it's kind of like a casual conversation talking about, what are their career prospects, and how can we achieve those goals that they like set to achieve. And so for those experiences, that's kind of more like just hoping to like helping them with their own career development. So it's kind of, so I don't have a lot of experience with like mentoring researchers per se, but more so mentoring in a like professional setting. And so I guess I hope in the future when I become a graduate student, I do gain more of those, you know, research oriented mentoring skills, like, oh, how do you use this technique, or how do you code up this script to analyze our data. Things like that are what I hope to achieve later on, kind of combining my outside work with my research work. Yeah.
And bringing that synergy back together, like you say.
Hmm.
And I suppose in terms of thinking about this from more the scientists and researchers that are around you, you've said about your academic community. Is there anyone thinking more abstract now, individuals you haven't met but whose work you've admired, or maybe you've seen them on TV? Is there anyone like that you would say, thinking back to your more childhood, is there anyone that really inspired you in that capacity? Like, I want to do something like that person's doing. Is there anyone like that? Like, thinking of the likes of David Attenborough and so on from uh, people who are interested in animals.
So I have a weird answer to this question, but ironically, like I enjoyed the Big Bang Theory a lot as a kid. And like I said, I didn't really know about science as a career path, and so as a child, you don't really understand those jokes or what a PhD is. You don't understand those things when you're a kid. But one of the actresses on that show, Mayim Bialik or something, yeah. So she got her neuroscience PhD at UCLA. My mom also knows her from high school, but not formally, but they went to the same high school at the same time. And so she was able to combine her passion for neuroscience, get her PhD, do all of the neuroscientist things. But then she also has her career as, a actress, and kind of having that balance between, I can be educated and I can be a scientist, but then also having that passion of like, I can, you know, be whatever I want to be. So I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that was really inspiring to me, as someone that does, science as a 9 to 5, and then spends my extracurriculars kind of like doing social media content and things like that. I feel like that was really inspiring to me, especially once I kind of look back and I see that, um, you know, back when she was doing her neuroscience PhD and such, it was very much a male dominated field. And now we're kind of seeing a shift where it's more equally distributed between men and women in neuroscience. And so to see that kind of shift also has been inspiring. So I don't know. I kind of bounce back and forth there, but yeah.
No, I think, like you say, I think even though I suppose it's more the actress herself rather than the role that she played. But I mean, equally, people have been inspired by the roles of various people hold, and I mean, I'm sure the characters on Big Bang Theory have probably been an inspiration for someone, and the same as well, on multiple different programs. I mean, the people. I'm
Like
more
Grey's
towards
Anatomy for
Grey's
like
Anatomy,
medicine.
doctors.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm just about old enough to have seen like the likes of ER and that on, or at least the reruns versions of it, and I know that's inspired a lot of people to go into that and various different things like that. I think the portrayal of various different professions is such a useful thing for various different young people to see, and I I'm interested in. I normally ask a number of different guests about their opinions in terms of the association of seeing people, whether that's their parents in other professional roles, which are not what they go into, but it's various professions or the various different characters on TV, and what value do you see in that representation of those various different roles, and particularly the diversity of those roles?
Yeah, so for my parents at least, my mom, she has associate's degrees and kind of like certifications. So she went to community college and she had a more technical perspective on, go to school to make money. And then my dad, he had some college, never got a full like associate's or anything, but he also works now in the federal government. And so that was another kind of like, oh, you have to go to school to make money, or you have to get a job that makes money. And so um, I guess that is one of the reasons why. Like, I wasn't aware of science being a profession. Not saying that science doesn't make money, but saying that I had only ever known what my like suburb had access to. So, like real estate or technology, or, I guess I knew about doctors and lawyers, but I didn't ever see myself in those positions. Um, and so I feel like I felt behind once I started college and started realizing that there had been people that really saw themselves as scientists from, a very young age. And I never had that same experience until I talk to people like graduate students, and I kind of heard their stories about like, oh, when you're a professor at a university, you're teaching on the side, but your main job is like research for like R1 institutions, not all institutions. And I immediately knew that that was the path for me, but I would have never known that that was the path for me hadn't someone kind of showcased that to me in the first place, because I didn't know what PhD students were. I didn't even know what a PhD really was, except for, like I said, if I heard it on Big Bang Theory or something. But then on the other side, seeing like diversity, seeing people not on like on TV and also in social media, seeing the different types of people that can become scientists has been really impactful over the past few years. In psychology, especially, pretty much most of the professors are men. They a lot of my professors or even the graduate students were kind of on the older side. They seemed very experienced with maybe they have like 20 or 30 years of research experience. And that was very daunting at first. But then when I see uh, people on social media that are like my age and they're doing like neuroscience research, they're graduate students. I've seen a few people that are, in their late 20s and they're already professors at, colleges. Or when I see things like that, that feels more welcoming like academia feels more welcoming in that sense. Because before I thought, you had to get like a million publications and you have to have a million years of experience in order to really make it to the top. I've had a few mentors that have basically told me, like, oh, this field is really hard to get into, and you're really gonna have to be like a top person, and that can have a lot of different connotations depending on how you view, like socioeconomic status, and how that kind of also influences your ability to get positions, or other biases that could also influence your success in the field. So I don't like having that mentality, but that was still instilled in me. And then I see people with, like I said, like different backgrounds, different perspectives. They're achieving the dreams that I want to achieve, and I it feels more welcoming than seeing, just men and just, people like with a lot of experience. I don't know. I That's kind of my way of thinking about it.
No, I think like you say as well, and I think uh, as well as seeing individuals, I know from my own perspective that there are a lot of people who have been in positions which are have very similar characteristics. A lot of white men still have a lot of very prominent displays in virtually every university campus you go into. There'll be a poster of someone who's probably, I mean, generally speaking, they tend to be about 30 years, I would hope, ahead in terms of what their headshots, in terms of what they look like in the displays. But that is a lot of the typical representation that people have across STEM. And I think one of the main things from a representation point of view is when a lot of people think, the representation is a bit more of a, for whatever reason, and at our, I would say, detriment, that it's being looked at in more of a negative light than what it is, but it's more pointing it to, it's highlighting how different people have got to the various different positions that they have, what their journey is, how that journey has taken place, and just what the various different routes in are. Because I know, from speaking from a perspective as being first generation, neurodiverse, that a lot of people sharing those stories, whatever. Now, my story might not resonate with everyone, but it might resonate with some people, and that hearing the perspective of various different individuals has such an impact on both you while you're at that point, as well as the generation who's coming before you. And so long as, I think, one of the main things that I hope that most people who are currently in any form of level of their academic journey, so long as they're doing something that is helping someone else to overcome the same challenge that they had, that's what, for me, what the representation and improving that type of area needs to be. It's more giving those people the opportunity to have, okay, this is what worked for me. It might not necessarily work for you, but this is one route. Here's another few routes, and this is someone else's experience, and so on. And so long as this can help your own experience, then hopefully you can help someone else and share your own perspective. And I think the human side of the research and the researcher is just as important as the accolades that people eventually win when they get to those, or are awarded when they get to the senior points. Because even people who are amazingly successful in their fields have had to climb various different milestones. And I do think we're so hung up on the accolades that we often forget about the journey that it takes to get to that point. But that's I suppose more my take on that. But thinking a slight pivot for yourself away from the more personable side of it. You've spoken a bit about what you hope in terms of in your field, in terms of where you hope to research, but what do you hope your impact from a research perspective would be? What is the hope in either in your field, or have you got an end goal in mind of an area that you want to research if given the opportunity, and what do you hope to achieve in that?
Yeah, so I kind of have a few different answers to this, depending on how uh, the cards play out, essentially. So I know I want to be a memory researcher. Like I said, I want to explore dopamine in memory, or even potentially like sleep in memory, things like that. Um, but then with my neuroscience degree and on in the future, I hope to be one of two things: either a research scientist or a professor, so academia, that kind of individual that does research and kind of teaches or lectures. I want to be that individual, not just so I can say, like, oh, I'm a professor at a university, but more so to really be the guidance for students that I wish that I had starting in research. Because, like I said, not all of my experiences with mentors has been 100% positive. And I found that having a more personable professor or graduate student or mentor, that really does make a positive influence on how you view your career, how you view your future trajectory. And so I would love to be able to continue contributing to research, and finding out more about human memory and how can we improve it, how can we even come up with sort of clinical interventions for people with memory issues. Things like that is like an amazing thing. But then also on the side, inspiring the next generation of scientists to go on and do their own research questions. It doesn't have to be in memory, of course, but go on to pursue their own research questions. Um, and then the other thing would be, if academia doesn't work out, then I would do like a neuroscience and education thing. So starting even younger. So with my neuroscience background, kind of going to the individuals at K through 12, the level that I didn't know about science as a career, and going to those students and saying, hey, you can do this and you can for sure like become educated and you can have a career in science if you want to. I feel like those are my two main goals. I kind of have a more community focused approach, as you said. I don't know. That's just my take on science.
Now, I think it's interesting because I think from a perspective of most scientists I've spoken to, as well as some guests that I've had who've had very similar questions to that, most people tend to take the stab at it from more, it's understanding focused. It's to help add some, not necessarily, it's not, most people, I think, when they think of science, they think of technology or anything in that type of capacity. It's end goal, cure this, fix this, resolve that. And most scientists, when they present it back, tend to say, whether that's from a more humble perspective, I don't know, different people read it different ways, but it's more, I want to contribute to the understanding of the field. I want to help either push it in that direction. And I think that's where hopefully people listening to this episode will have the take that that's what research is. That's what academia should look like. It's not the shiny award for the finished completion of a great piece of work, which, yes, if you speak to anyone who has done that, that will definitely be something that they're proud of. But it's the wider contribution that they have to the field of the discipline as well, which I think has a lot of impact. But now thinking about that other side, the community side that you've highlighted, What was the thing that pushed you to start on social media?
So I guess when I was an undergrad, I started a club. Oh, okay. Well, I guess I'll go back a little. So basically, I got my first research position in undergrad kind of through luck. I had applied to places and I had emailed places, but I never got anywhere with it. And so I went up to my professor one day and I said, I want to work with you. And the conversation wasn't that encouraging, but I still emailed him afterwards and I said, I still want to work with you. And because I showed that initiative, he really uh, took me on under his wing and I worked with him for a few years. And so once I started realizing the power of initiative and the power of connections, email etiquette, resume formatting, these things that I didn't know beforehand, being a first generation student, um, and not being told, like, how do you talk to professors? How do you talk to graduate students? How do you make those connections? I feel like I started a club to basically provide those same resources. So, how do you talk to a professor? How do you ask them to be in their lab? How do you how do you show your interest where it's not too broad that they think, oh, this student doesn't know what they're talking about, but it's not too direct that they think, oh, this student isn't a good fit for my lab either. So I did that, and I saw a lot of students get a lot of positions through the resources that I provided. They would come up to me and they would say, "Oh, I used, your email template, and now I have a position at this lab." Or they would say, like, "Oh, because you held that seminar, I now know about a professor that I want to talk to and reach out to." Um, so I saw the impact that even just like club meetings had, and I wanted to transfer that after I graduated to a more broad audience. And so I started making videos basically saying the same thing, like, how do you get your first research position? How do you, uh, you know, kind of formulate your letter of interest to a professor? What questions do you ask a professor when you're meeting them for the first time to kind of like engage in like a scientific conversation? Um, so I would make a lot of videos on that at first, and I still sometimes do. Um, but I think that was kind of the main thing, is that I wanted to provide resources for students that didn't have that same background in, like communication and science, because I kind of learned through trial and error. And so whenever I learned something that was really effective, like emailing or something, I wanted to push that forward to other students that might not have that same like resource.
And I think it's interesting to hear that from what you're describing, a lot of it is the resource that you would have liked if it had it been there years ago would have been
Yeah.
that's what you're providing, and equally providing it in a freemium type content uh, rather than going from the perspective. There are, as I'm sure everyone who probably is listening is aware, there are a million ones, various tools that you can pay to do it for you, but the vast majority of great resources out there are completely free because someone has gone through that experience, learned from that experience, and is prepared to share that with you so that you can benefit from that experience most of the time, so long as you just ask for it. It's the same with most researchers who will happily share their research papers with you rather than behind the paywall of a journal, because they're more than happy to talk about it, share it with you. Most people
Yeah.
will.
And I especially like TikTok, because it has that algorithm that you're not looking for this content most of the time. What happens is you'll like a few college videos, and then one of my videos or similar other creators' videos will pop up and it'll be like, hey, did you know if you want to get your first research position, you should go to office hours and connect with your professor on a personal level, things like that. And I feel like that kind of algorithmic way of finding content is also more beneficial, because sometimes people don't know what they don't know. They don't know what they're missing. They might, maybe they're already sending emails to professors, but they're not getting any responses, and they don't know why they're being left on red. And so, you know, having this sort of kind of randomized, in a way, type of way of showcasing content, I feel has been really beneficial to current and upcoming students.
Yeah, and like you say, I think the other thing is uh, thinking in terms of how students, as you say, come across that pieces of information, whether that is, I've certainly gone on there before when I've gone on for a recipe, for argument's
Mm-hmm.
sake, and then you get a million and one different recipes or different things like that, or a solution to whatever, and you think to yourself, this is a really used well. The algorithms work really, really well in terms of helping people to learn. They That does come with the caveat of some of the problems that comes with them as well from the opposite side. But I think, like you say, quite often you'll discover someone new. You might engage with one or two of their videos, then you engage with some other videos that they have, and that's how that very early advice, ad hoc mentorship becomes present. And I think, like, the other side, as you said, about the not knowing what you don't know until it's potentially presented to you. And I think quite often as individuals, we can see a very negative perspective in terms of I'm not sure if you've had this experience, but I certainly have, where I was applying for graduate jobs before I went into teaching. I must have sent out 20, 30, even upwards of that job applications off. And the problem is, until you get that bit of advice, bit of guidance that tells you what you're doing wrong, you don't know any better until you have that first correction. And in some cases, a lot of people will be great in a lot of positions if they're given that little bit of information that helps them pivot around that. But until they get that, the trial and error doesn't expecting people to change their behavior without knowing what bit of their behavior is the problem, or not the problem, which is the wrong approach, is challenging. And I think especially for individuals in the neurodiverse community, unless you know what you're putting that across, and I think this particularly, I'm not sure your experience with it, so like psychometric tests for a lot of neurodiverse individuals, you're having to approach that from the perspective of what is the right answer that they want, rather than what is the answer that I would provide that. And that's some of the problems I think individuals face. And until they have that corrected or pointed out to them, I think it's a very difficult relationship. And the resources that you provide from both graduate schools, those types of perspectives, I think highlight, even if the student is getting most of the things right, they'd highlight, oh, this is what they put together. Maybe this is an element that I'm missing, and then they try it, and if it works, it works. And that's, I'm assuming, is what you're hoping to get from it, from yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly what I hope to do with individuals. Like, I was talking with someone earlier, and they had a stellar application for graduate school. But then I was talking about my experience, and I said, oh, I kind of emphasized, personality more in my applications. A lot of applications are kind of like clear cut. This is what I want to do. This is my qualifications, and this is who I want to work with. Because that's kind of like the formatting of the essay questions. They say, okay, answer these questions. And so that's how people write the applications. And I said, oh, well, I kind of did a more personality approach, kind of told a story, kind of saying, these are the skills that I have, not just technical, but then also personality wise. And that person said, I didn't take that into consideration, but next time I apply, I'll try to implement that same kind of mentality, or at least tweak my applications a bit to kind of incorporate that. So I hope that those kind of outcomes are what is kind of presented through my resources or through my advice and things like that.
I think, like you say, though, that's definitely I think that general guidance of how to compose, complete, or approach that, because, like you say, most applications are approached very clear cut. Generally the recruiter will think they're recruiting for the right thing that they've asked for, and half the
Mm-hmm.
time they get applications back. And I've been on this side of the recruiter where the individuals that then apply for the roles are not answering the questions as you intended, and half of the time it's because somewhere along that dialogue the questions have been tweaked in a way that they're asked in a way that people who respond to them are approaching them completely differently. But thinking a lot of this is around the resources you provide as a content educator. So thinking to either yourself or the current generation of content education, what would you say are the biggest challenges for individuals in those positions?
So are you saying for uh, the content creators or for the viewers?
So more for the content educators
Mhm.
themselves.
Yeah. So I've noticed that I guess a big caveat for content educators, or like a big downside, could be kind of retention. I think sometimes I'll make a really informative video. Maybe it'll be, 1 to 2 minutes long. And I've noticed that it either doesn't get a lot of views because people kind of assess the first 10 seconds and then continue on with their day. Or if it does get watched to the end, I've received a few comments being like, okay, well, why did you spend 2 whole minutes talking about this? I've received a few of those comments as well. And so it's kind of hard with content educators to be uh, to kind of find the middle ground. So how are you going to display your information to the way in a way that people are going to view it and retain it and really appreciate it, versus how are you going to talk about information in enough depth or with enough explanation that like generalizable audiences will understand it. And I feel like I still have that same conflict where I want to provide more generalizable content, not just to people on like PhD routes, but people in college in general. But when I've tried doing that in the past, people say, "Oh, you're not giving enough information," or "Oh, you over-explained your point," and so that's a big struggle that I face. And I don't know if you also have faced like similar experiences with, like content and things like that.
Yeah, I've definitely had not necessarily all the same, but very similar. I've had the whole where you've had a particular point that you've made, and individuals then say, "Oh, this is why have you spent the time going through this?" And then you also think, "Well, why have you spent 5 minutes listening to
Mm-hmm.
this if it wasn't something that?" But then you have some topics are inherently complicated. Some topics can be summed up in a 30-second to a minute video, and I think until people produce some of those videos, they don't realize how short 30 seconds is,
Mm-hmm.
or 10 seconds is, in terms of trying to get people's attention and keep their attention. But I think the other caveat that a lot of people that I see a lot of more creators when they get to a certain point is then they get the whole, why are you spending your time doing this? And it's thinking, because if I want to go and talk to scientists and other academics, I'm already doing that. This is not
Mm-hmm.
something that I'm doing because it's part of my day job. It's an element of what I'm trying to do to add a bit of outreach or to encourage more representation of the field. It's not because my day job is perfectly happy focusing on the talking to the various different academics, but I'm consciously aware that most that you're preaching to a lot of the converted when you're talking to scientists and academics. You need to. The whole point of content education is talking to a lay audience, trying to get them to understand elements of what scientists do in various different fields, why scientists do the various work that they're doing, such as why there are people who study literature and why there are people who study various different niche areas, and it's, but what's the benefit of that? There's a lot of benefit to it if you speak to the individual about it, because it's broadening understanding. But I think a lot of people get put off by just the inherent negatives of comments that every one of us will have received in different ways. And the easy way, I would say, most scientists could get a lot of better engagement or longer engagement, let's say, by going to controversial topics. But there's a reason why controversy is not something that you want to court, because it's not something that is inherently both healthy for you and healthy for the communities that you're trying to engage with. That's otherwise it'd be you just see, well, you do see on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, the same debates on I would say, very particular points that people talk about time after time after time, and you have two polarizing views, then that's what you have. But I don't think that helps, because two polarizing views are they're the vocal individuals, and it's people in the middle that you're trying to communicate to. And if I impact one person, then that if one person watches my video to the end, gets something out of it, and it's some form of positive value to them, then that was the point of making that video or writing that article. If nothing else, one, two, whoever individuals they are. And I do think as well, I'm not sure if you've had this, having the conversation with what I class as the migrating viewer versus the followers who stay for a prolonged period of time. The followers, they get a lot out of your content generally. They engage quite often, they talk, they discuss. It's you have a bit of a dialogue, a bit of that community. And then you have the individuals who come across one video and you think, well, I've talked about this five or six videos ago. If you go back 5 or 6, you'll see it. But that's up to you to do that. It's the same, but I do think the migrating viewer is a challenge in itself.
Yeah, that's definitely a caveat to the algorithmic, like TikTok that I was talking about earlier, where people are going to get your videos randomly, and then you don't know what their background is. You don't know how they're going to view your content. I've definitely had those moments where I've had a video go viral and people say, well, why didn't you explain like what a cold email is in this video? And that's because I had made 5 other videos right before then about cold emailing, and I didn't expect this particular one to go viral. But because it went viral, now I have a bunch of people saying that I'm not a good educator because I didn't explain it in detail in a 5-second video, and so that's definitely an issue that I have faced as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the expectations that a lot of people have in terms of, I do think, unfortunately, the challenge of that I want it now and I want all of it in this type of format is a challenge that is, unfortunately, I think how we're learning more is that's the approach to learning that is rapidly evolving. And I think we have to have, as viewers, realistic expectations. And I suppose that leads me into what I think is, what do you think some of the impacts of these challenges are more on the next generation? So more from the viewer's perspective, what do you think the challenge is for them, the caveats or problems?
I don't know. I guess for viewers, it can be a little hard. I don't know, actually. I don't know. Can you ask the question again? And
yeah, so what do you think some of the challenges are for the viewers of various different pieces of content? And one example that I would always come back to with this, that hopefully might help, is when a lot of individuals have what I would class as the easy win content. This will make you rich. This will fix this health problem. This will do this. If it's often too good to be true, it more than likely is. That is one challenge that I think individuals need to recognize, but that's just one observation that's across all platforms.
Yeah. So another challenge I think for um, viewers is when you see science content that is very obviously from a person that is kind of like they make social media their job, and so they're talking about this scientific discovery or this scientific thing. Sometimes it'll be a pill or something that they said, oh, this study had just shown that this pill is improving your memory um, every day. You take it every day. And I have a PhD in neuroscience, so I know that this works. So people sometimes using their credentials to sell things. I've seen some of that, and it's kind of on the same topic as you, where like if it seems too good to be true, you want to fact check it, but then a lot of viewers aren't going to have the same scientific background in order to fact check these things. And so that's a bit of a caveat to making science content, is that if you say something, people are going to take that as truth. They're going to take that as fact, because a lot of the time they're not going to have that same background to really analyze the science behind it. I mean, some of them are. Some of the people that come up on my videos are like, "Oh, I'm a professor at a university," and so you will sometimes get people like that. But like the lay audience that you're trying to convey your information to, um, they're going to be people that are just interested in this topic and might not have that same background, I guess, to formulate the ideas or concepts.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I mean, whether that be access or whether that be the perspective or educational background that individuals have, and in some cases, whether it be the field that you're in. I know if
Mm-hmm.
my background's not in the likes of, it's in more educational and biological sciences. If someone presented a new discovery in chemistry or in physics, that would be like explaining rocket science to me. It's not
Yeah,
my field. I'd understand the general
exactly.
concepts of the paper, but I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
understand in terms of what it's actually discussing. I'd probably be able to read it to a degree because of having more of an informed knowledge base, but it's a skill in itself, academic writing, never mind the field in itself in terms of the discipline. But I do think one of the other challenges, I think, that for content educators is the retraction of something. Now, anything that we say at this point in our career may well be highly relevant and highly reliable at that time. But research may come along, and I know there's a number of different researchers now that have said, "Well, I've retracted that paper. It's no longer it. I've learned more from it." But the problem is that paper has formed the basis of so many other papers which individuals use, and it's hard to explain that to a lot of people in terms of, well, that paper was disproven, and it's the source of various other papers that have been used. And I think that's from an academic point of view, not necessarily from a disciplinary point of view. That in itself is a challenge, and I mean, for many academics, I think most academics miss those types of things unless they're in that field, because
Yeah.
it's not the first thing that you notice.
Yeah, and I've been on the receiving end of that, where I've watched like YouTube videos and they would say like, "Oh, this hypothesis, this is a really well-established hypothesis in the field." And then I would go. This would happen in undergrad, and then I would go to class and I would say, "Oh, I was learning about this hypothesis, and I'm really interested in like studying that." And then someone will say, "Oh, that's actually not relevant anymore. That video was like 5 years old. That this is, science now is kind of focused more on this." So I do see that caveat as well, with content being kind of permanent, the internet, keeping track of everything. And unfortunately, someone is going to come across your content from months or a year ago, and it might not be relevant to current current day or current things.
And I think that's one area, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is how AI presents that information. Because
Mm.
if either of us were to publish a book or a journal or a paper or whatever, that would have a date stamp to it that would be generally seen as relevant to the time when it was published, with the caveat that most people know that paper is probably taking a year to write, 2 years to put together, and as a result, it has a date to it. Whereas AI will source whatever information is relevant to that general topic, no matter how old it is, and present it as current. And I think that, to me, is a problem in terms of relevance. It's something I try and teach when I'm talking to students about AI literacy, in terms of asking it the right question, but also knowing when that information is reliable and relevant is also important. And it's very hard to get that side of it from the program in itself. But I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, so I hope that, with people working on AI, we can kind of go against these kind of caveats. It just seems that, like you said, you put a prompt or you put a question in, chat GPT or something, and then it comes out with this really beautiful essay or this really beautiful paragraph on what you just asked, but then it's pulling information from like years ago. It's pulling information from Google's like very first, search or something. And sometimes I'll even see this with the Google AI feature. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
you have
Yeah.
noticed this, but it'll come up with a really good summary, but then you look deeper into the sources that it's using, and it'll be two conflicting uh, like scientific papers from 20 years ago, and this is what it's using to classify as, it's like, oh, this is the correct answer. um, and so I don't know how I feel about it. I think it just needs more time to be refined, and hopefully people can kind of uh, like implement in these large language models to, include sources, kind of like a sign or like a essay, kind of where it cites where it is pulling this information from. And I feel like that will be easier on a learning standpoint and also just a communication standpoint as well.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely. I do think I'm not, by no means am I against AI. I think it's, as a tool, it's highly useful.
Hmm.
I think so long as there's the literacy element there, and I do think ignoring it is definitely not the way we should go, because I don't think that's a great use of the tool. But I do think recognizing that there are still limitations, and in some cases you still need to be able to tell it what it's doing, because in some cases it will give you the most popular. Uh,
Hmm.
Most popular does not necessarily mean that is the correct answer. It does. In a lot of cases, the correct answer might be a nuanced answer, depending on whatever you're looking for in that perspective, and depending on the question you ask, you'll get a completely different popular take. So someone from the same class may ask the completely different question or prompt and get a completely different response, both technically correct, but equally could be so far removed from what the question that the individuals actually wanted answered, that it might be completely off the pace of the what they're looking for.
Hmm.
But I think one of the things that I think most academics are a bit more uncertain of with AI, and uncertain with in terms of how we communicate our information or knowledge, is how we perceive the legacy of ourselves afterwards, in terms of whether that's in research, communication, publication. What do you what would you want your legacy to be? I know we're both at the early stages of our careers, but what would you hypothetically want that to be?
I guess I have mentors from my undergraduate that are kind of well known in their respective fields, but for different reasons. One of them is a technique based reason. And so this means like a lot of citations. This means a lot of people using this toolbox, a lot of people reading this, like the textbooks on this. And so there's like that perspective, like a very academic perspective. And then there's the other mentor that I have that's more of like a popular scientist now. So he's doing podcasts. He's uh, giving like TED Talks or, lectures internationally, talking to the lay person about science. I'm still debating which one I prefer, but I'm leaning more towards popular science, writing a
Hmm.
book, talking with individuals that don't know much about science or specifically neuroscience. Because like you said, they could be like a physicist or something, but just not have that background in neuroscience that would be needed. I feel like that is kind of leaning where I'm leaning towards. If I wanted to have a legacy where someone could be like, oh, I know of Jacinda, like they wrote that book that was really compelling and really got me interested in human memory, so something like that is probably why I'm also leaning more towards like a science communication or like a mentorship type position with research. Is I want to really inspire and help like individuals um like get into science, if that makes sense.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And I think the flip to legacy is you said about with the various different mentors and the individuals that have given you that kind of direction in terms of how you want your legacy to be. Have you given any thought to what your academic heritage is? So not your personal heritage, but how you've been shaped in terms of your approach to research by the individuals in the scientific community that surrounded you. How would you describe that?
So I like to think that my mentors really did kind of shape this really narrow path for me. So where I talk about like dopamine and memory, I feel like that really comes from my various mentors. I had one mentor that, he does MRI research in memory, and he had a very strict way of thinking of like science needs to be, top notch. Science needs to be really like good. If it's going to get published, it needs to be uh, very like accurate, essentially. And
Mhm.
then I had another mentor that was like working memory and such, and he kind of shaped me more into the inclusivity aspect of science. So we're going to inspire other people from different backgrounds into pursuing science. That was his main thing, and he is also more known for his lecturing, and so that also kind of shaped me academically because I he was the first person I saw that really did balance research and mentoring slash teaching. And then my various other mentors have helped me with, like humility. In even though they're really well known, they're very humble and they don't kind of uh, express like, oh, I'm a leading neuroscientist in this field. They're kind of like, oh, that's my mentor. It's a very casual kind of thing, and I feel like all those different aspects, both research wise, shaping my interests, but then also personality wise and how I view science. I feel like those all really come through together with my various mentors.
And it's interesting as well the contrast between the research mentor more so and the teaching mentors and how their approaches differ. But no, it's interesting to see how they've shaped your personal professional development. But in terms of now asking you the question more on, we've spoken about legacy, we've spoken about heritage. Now, what would be the token bit of advice that you wish you would have received as a researcher starting off, and what is that advice to the researcher or student going forward?
So I think the main thing is when you are starting in research, you're starting in science, it is all about perseverance. So even though people are going to say, like, oh, it's a really tough path, or some people are going to say, oh, it's a really fun path, you need to kind of go into it knowing that you need to face challenges. And this can be like something as simple as like your data coming out like insignificant in results, or it could be something as challenging as like I applied to 2 or 3 graduate application cycles and I didn't get in. I've seen the spectrum of challenges that are faced in like science and academia, and I think just having that personal goal kind of fuel you and kind of be like, I know this is what I want to pursue and I'm going to pursue it no matter what challenges I face. I feel like that is the mentality that I would hope to encourage students. So to not give up on their dreams, even though it can seem bleak a lot of the time. That would be my advice.
No, I think very sound advice at that. And my next question for you, Jacinda, is not really my question for you. It's Toby's question. So Toby was asking, do you think that the you of 10 years ago would be happy with who you are today?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, 10 years ago, I was in middle school. I had no career prospects. I kind of just stayed at home all the time, but I've really gotten out of my shell. Now I talk to people, internationally. I talk to people through social media. I go to events, whether that be scientific or whether that be like social. And then um, I think me 10 years ago would look at me now and say, like, you're doing amazing. Even if I'm not the best, at what I do, or if I'm not, like super well known. It's just the fact that I went from shy and not knowing what I wanted to do to having a very clear career goal and a very clear, like social not status, but I guess like a
Hmm.
community of people that I connect with. I think that would be what my past self would view me as.
That sense of belonging in the people who, broadly speaking, represent who
Hmm.
you like to see yourself as.
Yeah, yeah.
So now, Jacinda, this is the opportunity in sitting down with scholars for you to ask my next guest your question, like Toby just asked uh, yours. So, what question would you ask the next content educator or researcher generally about their work, their impact? Any question that you would like to know about their work?
I guess I would like to ask, what was their first moment that they knew that they wanted to be a content educator or a researcher? Like, when was that moment that really just they knew that was what they wanted to do? You kind of touch on it a little bit in your questions. So if it's kind of like a repeat, then let me know. But I think that's like the
No,
question I'd ask.
I certainly think, especially given trying to find out from different people's perspective, what was that particular point of what gave them that start, rather, like you say, rather than the earlier questions, which is more around what pushed you forward. We don't necessarily focus on that first crunch point. It's more the why rather than the what. So yeah,
Hmm.
I think, and especially for individuals who are more potentially research focused, it would be interesting to know why they took the dive and to pursue that research career. But thank you very much for joining me, Jacinda, and sitting down with us and talking about your academic journey at this point. And hopefully, we continue to see you go on to different things. And thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.